Chapter 20 of Inspector French's Greatest Case by Freeman, Wills, Crofts. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganand. Inspector French's Greatest Case, Chapter 20, Conclusion. Given the key of the identity of the murderer, it was not long before Inspector French had unearthed all the details of the murder of Charles Getting and the theft of the diamonds, and had arranged them with a due regard to their proper bearing and sequence. And he found, as he had so often found before, that what had seemed a complicated and insoluble mystery was really a very simple happening after all. Briefly, the facts which came out partly as a result of a renewed investigation and partly from Mr. Duke's confession were as follows. Reginald Ainsley Duke had lived a happy and contented life until a terrible calamity befell him. His wife's brain gave way, and with splendid physical health she had to be removed to an asylum, a dangerous and incurable lunatic. Though he had never been passionately in love with her, they had been sincerely attached, and for some time he was crushed beneath the blow. But in his case, as in others, time softened the sharpness of his grief, and this terrible period of his life gradually became a hideous, though fading nightmare. Then he saw Miss Sissy Winter act at the comedy, and feeling attracted to her, he arranged a meeting. The attraction proved to be mutual, and other meetings followed, as a result of which he fell violently, overwhelmingly in love with her. To his unbounded and ecstatic delight, he found his passion was returned. Their problem then was a common one. Obviously, they could not marry, so after much thought, they did what a good many other people would have done in their place, set up an unconventional household. Their difficulty was Duke's daughter. Had it not been for her, they would have taken no trouble to hide their predicament. But Duke did not want any stigma to rest on her, and with Miss Winter's approval, he decided to live a double life and keep two establishments. A simple disguise being necessary, he took for his model Vanderkemp, partly because the traveller was somewhat of his own height and build, and partly in the hope that where he at any time followed from the office to his second dwelling, he might be mistaken for Vanderkemp. With the help of the actress, he evolved a make-up consisting of a wig, a false moustache, and glasses, and exchanged his own upright carriage for Vanderkemp's stoop. As Duke, he retained his own personality. As Wayne, he wore make-up. Their plan had met with such success that no suspicions were aroused. To his daughter, he explained his frequent absences by saying he had to keep in constant touch with the Amsterdam branch, and the servants at Pennington, the forerunner of Crew Lodge, were given to understand he was a traveller for a firm of engineers. The arrangement worked successfully until the war began to interfere with the profits of his business, and then the keeping up of his two homes became a burden greater than he could bear. For a time he struggled on, but an insidious temptation had begun to haunt him, and the greater his difficulties grew, the stronger it became. Here was he virtually in control of the business. His partners gave it but little attention. Peabody was old and doddering, and Cinnamon was well off and spent most of his time travelling. A little juggling with figures, a few slight alterations to the books, and he would have all the money he wanted. He resisted with all his strength, but even in doing so, he saw fresh ways in which the thing could be carried out with absolute safety, as he believed, and eventually he fell. His plans worked as he had expected. His financial difficulties were met, and he congratulated himself that all would be well. But there was one thing on which he had not reckoned. He forgot that a man cannot start a deceit or a swindle and stop when he likes it. He soon discovered that each falsified entry required some further manipulation to buttress it up, and in spite of all his efforts, he found himself becoming more and more deeply involved. And then came the inevitable, unforeseen catastrophe. His head clerk, Charles Getting, began to suspect. He made an investigation, confirmed his suspicions, and with characteristic straightforwardness showed his discoveries to his employer, declaring that his duty required him to call in the other partners. Duke, seeing he was up against it, played for time by stoutly swearing that Getting had made a mistake and promising him a complete explanation and proof that all the books were in order if the clerk would only wait until he got some balancing figures from the Amsterdam office. He left that evening for Crew Lodge, and there he told Miss Winters the whole story. That astute lady saw that, though through simple expedient of wearing a wedding ring she had covered up their first departure from orthodoxy, this was a different matter. Here discovery would mean prison for her lover, and destitution for herself. It did not take her long to make up her mind that there should be no discovery. Exercising all her arts, she succeeded after a struggle in bringing Duke round to her way of thinking, and the two set their wits to work to devise a scheme by which to safeguard themselves. Miss Winters supplied the main idea of the plan. Duke, who was thorough rather than brilliant, worked out the details. In short, the scheme was to stage a robbery at the office, murder Gething, get hold of as many stones as possible, and then make a leisurely departure for distant and more healthy spheres. Miss Winter had a complete and first-hand knowledge both of Brazil and the United States. Her father was English, but having as a young man sent to Rio as representative of his firm, he had settled down there, married a Portuguese wife, and made his home in the Brazilian capital. His daughter had a genius for acting, and on her parents' death, while she was yet in her teens, she succeeded in getting a start on the Rio stage. After 5 years, she accepted an engagement with an enterprising New York manager who had seen her act during a visit to Brazil. 2 years later, she came to London and had there met Mr. Duke, as already stated. This knowledge of Brazil and America supplied the foundation of her scheme. Brazil represented an ideal country to which to retire after the crime, and their first care was to arrange a line of retreat thereto. They were well known in the neighborhood as Mr. and Mrs. Wayne, and had no difficulty in getting the certificates and letters of recommendation necessary to obtain the Brazilian passports. Having received the passports, Duke forged similar certificates and letters in the names of Da Silva, and having, with the aid of Miss Winter's theatrical knowledge, made themselves up in character, they applied at the same office a second time, obtaining 2 more passports in their assumed names. Thus they had 2 sets of Brazilian passports in the names of Wayne and Da Silva respectively. The next point was to procure some ready money immediately after the crime to enable the fugitives to purchase the necessary tickets to Brazil and for the host of other expenses which were certain to arise. With this object, the visit of Mrs. Wayne to New York was arranged. She was to travel there by one line and immediately return by another. During the voyage home, she was carefully to observe the passengers and select the most suitable person she could find to impersonate. She was to make friends with this woman, find out all she could about her, and observe her carefully so as to obtain as much data as possible to help her on the fraud. On arrival at Southampton, she was to see her prototype off at the station, ascertaining her destination. Then, going to some hotel, she was to make the necessary changes in her appearance, proceed to London in her new character, and put up where she was unlikely to meet the other. On the next day, she was to interview Williams, and if all had gone well up to this point, she was to telephone to Duke from a public call office so that he could proceed with his part of the affair. Finally, she was to meet him at 9:45 on the next evening on the emergency staircase of the Holborn Tube Station to obtain from him the portion of the spoils destined for Williams. In the meantime, Duke was to pacify Gething by promising him a full explanation of the apparent discrepancies, together with a sight of the actual cash needed to put matters right, on the receipt of certain letters from America. She was also to get together a large collection of stones as he possibly could. He was then to ask Gething to meet him at the office on the evening in the question, the evening of the day of Miss Winter's first interview with Williams, to go into the whole matter and see the proofs that all was right. Having thus got Gething into his power, he was to murder him, take out the diamonds and some money that was also in the safe, and having handed over to Miss Winter the few stones for Williams, go home as quickly as possible with the remainder. Though the scheme seemed to them good, the conspirators were not satisfied with it, and they added on 3 additional features to safeguard themselves still further in the event of suspicion being aroused. The first of these was an alibi for Mr. Duke. He arranged that he would dine and spend the evening at his club with his solicitor, leaving at a certain definite prearranged hour. By suitable remarks to the solicitor and the club porter, he would fix this hour, and by similar remarks to his servants, he would establish the time at which he reached his house. The interval between would be sufficient to enable him to walk home, and he would take care to inform the police that he had so occupied it. But in reality, he would taxi from near the club to near the office, commit the murder, and return to Hampstead by tube. The second safeguard took the form of an attempt to throw suspicion on to Vanderkemp. In carrying this out, Duke himself typed the secret instructions which brought the traveller to London, and he gave Gething orders to see Vanderkemp on his arrival, send him on his wild goose chase to the continent, and hand him some of the notes of which he had reason to believe the bank had the numbers, and which he afterwards swore were stolen from the safe. Events after the crime moved so well from the conspirators' point of view that they did not at first put their third safeguard into action. Indeed, they began to think that even retirement from Brazil would be unnecessary, and that they could continue their life in London as formerly. But the chance remark of Inspector French to Duke that he had discovered that the elusive Mrs. X was Miss Sissy Winter showed that the house of cards was falling to the ground, and immediately flight became imperative. Duke, afraid to visit Crewe Lodge, wrote the warning in cipher on which they had previously agreed. But by one of those strange chances which interfere to upset the lives and plans of mortals, just after he had posted it, the guilty pair met in a tube station. Loitering in a passage till they were alone, Duke gave his news by word of mouth. Then Miss Winter made the slip which compassed their downfall. She forgot about the cipher letter which Duke had said he had sent, and fled, leaving the letter to fall into the hands of the police. Duke then proceeded to carry out his third safeguard, to fake a suicide in order to account for his disappearance. This he did by means of a trick which they had carefully worked out beforehand, and which they also intended to employ on the booth liner to put the detectives off in case suspicion should be aroused. In this personality of Duke, he bought at Cook's office a return ticket from London to Amsterdam via Harwich, engaging his berth for that night and impressing his identity on the clerk. He then went on to Liverpool Street, and in his personality of Wayne, he took a return ticket from London to Brussels by the same route. As Duke, he had the passport he used on his occasional visits to Amsterdam. As Wayne, he had obtained a passport for Holland and Belgium some 18 months earlier, when he and Miss Winters had gone there for a short holiday. As Duke, he travelled down on the boat train to Harwich, choosing his carriage so that he would be among the first on board. He gave up his ticket at the office, receiving his landing ticket, and was shown to his cabin. There he arranged his things and left the note for his daughter. Then he put on his Wayne make-up, slipped out of the cabin unobserved, and joining the last stragglers from the train, presented his second ticket and was shown to the cabin he had reserved as Wayne. As Wayne, next day he went ashore, leaving behind him incontrovertible evidence of the death of Duke. At Rotterdam, he took tickets written via Hull, and travelling to Leeds, put up at the Victory Hotel until the date of the sailing of the Enoch. He and Miss Winter joined forces in the train between Leeds and Liverpool, and on going on board the liner, they attempted to throw any pursuing detective off the scent by carrying out the same ruse by which Duke had faked his suicide. They had taken 2 sets of tickets, one set at Cook's to Manos in the name of Wayne, and the other at the booth line offices to Para in the name of Da Silva, and had engaged state rooms and tried to impress their personalities on the clerks on each occasion. They had further provided themselves with sets of large and small suitcases. The small ones, in which they packed their clothes and diamonds, they labelled Da Silva. The large ones they labelled Wayne. They then put the Da Silva suitcases into the Wayne, went on board as Wayne, and were shown to the cabin. As Wayne, they went back to Persa and said they were going ashore. They went out on deck in the direction of the gangway, but instead of crossing it, they regained their cabin, made up as the Da Silvas, took out their small Da Silva suitcases, and slipping unseen from the cabin, returned to the Persa as having just come on board. The scheme as a whole worked out according to plan, save for Miss Winter's lapse in omitting to wait for and destroy the cipher letter, but though the principals did not know it, a coincidence took place which came within an ace of wrecking it. When Sylvia and Harrington were driving home from the East End on the night of the crime, they saw Mr. Duke turn out of Hatton Garden into Holborn. He was hurrying anxiously along the pavement with very different mien to his usual upright, leisurely bearing. There was something furtive about his appearance, and his face, revealed by a bright shaft of light streaming from a confectioner's shop, was drawn and haggard. Fearing some ill news, Sylvia had stopped the taxi and hurried after him, but before she had reached the pavement he had disappeared. She did not, however, take the matter seriously until at breakfast the next morning he told her of the crime. Even then it never occurred to her to suspect him. In fact, she had forgotten the incident, but when he went on to state, as it were casually, that he had been at his club all evening and had walked directly home from there, she remembered. She realized that he was lying, and suspicion was inevitable. In desperation, lest Harrington should unwittingly give away information which might put the police on her father's track, she rang him up and arranged an immediate meeting at which she warned him of the possibilities. That afternoon Harrington called to her how things had gone at the office, and then she had overwhelmed him by insisting on the postponement of the wedding until the affair should be cleared up. When, however, she learned that French suspected Harrington and herself of knowing the criminal, she thought the postponed marriage might give direction to his investigations, and to avoid this, she gave out that the ceremony had once again been arranged. The poor girl's mind was nearly unhinged, thinking of what she should do in the event of the police making an arrest, but fortunately for her, she was not called upon to make the decision. It remains merely to say that some weeks later, Reginald Ainsley Duke paid the supreme penalty for his crimes, and his daughter, hating London and England for the terrible memories they held, allowed herself to be persuaded for the third time to fix the date of the wedding with Charles Harrington and to seek happiness with him on his brother's ranch in Southern California. The firm of Duke and Peabody weathered the storm, and the surviving partners did not forget the Getting sisters when balancing their accounts. The end of Inspector French's greatest case.